CNN host Fareed Zakaria went after Biden on the issue of foreign policy, and he did it with an interesting argument. Check it out.
Ever since Donald Trump pulled out of the Iran deal, Joe Biden and his top advisors have made clear that the withdrawal was a serious mistake, one that dramatically undermined America's credibility with the world and created a more dangerous Middle East. The deal had placed Iran in a box, imposing strict limits on its nuclear program. Without them, Tehran was moving ever closer to nuclear weapons. So you'd assume that once in office, the Biden administration would be searching for a quick way to return to the deal. No, it turns out. Both the Secretary of State and the Director of National Intelligence say that rejoining the deal is a long ways away. They insist that Iran first come back into compliance, but that's largely a tactic to avoid confronting the issue. Diplomats could easily find a method for the two countries to rejoin simultaneously. Many of Biden's officials helped negotiate the Iran accord and argued strenuously it was the best deal that the United States could get. Have they changed their minds? On China, the administration has been falling over itself to prove how tough it is. The American readouts from both Biden's call with Xi Jinping and Secretary of State Blinken's call with his counterpart, Yang Jiechi, sound less like diplomatic documents than pieces of performance art designed for a domestic audience. They're studded with words like coercive and unfair, and have stern vows to hold Beijing accountable for its efforts to threaten stability. Now, the Biden campaign described Trump's trade war with China as an unmitigated disaster that cost Americans money and jobs. When Biden was asked in an August interview whether he would keep Trump's tariffs, he answered no, and offered a wholesale critique of Trump's China policies. But they are not being reversed. It is all under review. On Cuba, during the campaign, Biden attacked Trump's policies and pledged a return to the Obama-era effort to relax the embargo and engage with Cuba, arguing that these policies would be more effective in changing the island nation than the decades-long policy of isolation and sanctions. But nothing has been reversed. Again, it's all under review. Now, one would have thought Biden and his advisors had already spent the past 4 years carefully reviewing Trump's policies since they publicly concluded that they were disastrous. I suspect Biden's foreign policy team is trying to play domestic politics, hoping to deflect Republican criticism of being soft on U.S. foes. It won't work. Already, Republicans have sensed weakness, and they are pursuing a campaign to keep the Iran deal from ever being resurrected, which would then be touted as a great Republican victory. On China, Cliff Sims, a former top Trump official, responded to that tough readout of the Biden-Xi call by suggesting that it was a lie, and that the real story was the Bidens selling out the country with Chinese Communist Party business deals. Meanwhile, the same day, Mike Pompeo questioned the patriotism of Democrats and accused them of trying to funnel taxpayer dollars to the Chinese Communist Party. Let me confidently predict that no matter how aggressive Biden's policies, Marco Rubio, Tom Cotton, and Mike Pompeo will accuse him of appeasement. Democrats should keep in mind that when they run scared on foreign policy, they never win. Lyndon Johnson sent 500,000 troops into Vietnam for fear that Republicans would say he was soft on communism. After 9/11, Democrats eagerly voted for the Patriot Act and the Iraq War. John Kerry was a war hero with 3 Purple Hearts and, like Joe Biden, voted to authorize the invasion of Iraq. In return, Republicans smeared him as a coward who had lied about his war record. If you think about Barack Obama's foreign policy successes, the Paris Climate Accords, the Bin Laden raid, the Iran nuclear deal, the opening to Cuba, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, he achieved them because he was an unusual figure, willing to question bipartisan groupthink in Washington, take risks, and above all, stop conducting foreign policy on Republican terms.
That was a really interesting piece. Rare that you see on CNN a criticism of Joe Biden saying he's too far right, but that's exactly what that was. Now, I do think that the substance of the criticism is a little bit off, and I'll get to that in a second, but the the overarching picture here, he's correct about. Now, it's partly true that the reason why Joe Biden is doing the things that he's doing is because it's the old school New Democrat triangulation idea of like, well, I'm going to be above the fray. I'm not like these crazies on the left, and I'm not like these crazies on the right. I'm going to do like the reasonable centrist thing. And so he's continuing a lot of the Trump stuff on foreign policy, thinking like that'll prevent Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio from coming after him. Well, Fareed points out that's not going to happen. Doesn't matter what you do, they're always going to say it's bad, terrible, and wrong, and you're weak, or whatever. But where he's wrong is he doesn't get that a lot of what Biden is doing is not just domestic policy posturing. It's also because he himself is kind of like a moderate Republican, and to some extent agrees with a lot of this stuff. But beyond that, listen, it's the influence of money in politics and that foreign policy establishment. I mean, Blinken being Secretary of State, Blinken has taken a tremendous amount of money from all of these foreign government allies of ours, Saudi Arabia, UAE, Israel, and like, so they're gonna do the bidding of those countries. There is a kind of soft corruption here, which is unacceptable. And when you look at the foreign policy establishment in the military-industrial complex, we all know. It's like Lloyd Austin, who's his Secretary of Defense, I think it is. He was sitting on the board of Raytheon. He made like over $1 million from Raytheon, and now he's partly in charge of our foreign policy. Think about that, man. Think about that. So ultimately, what the administration is going to do is going to reflect what Raytheon, Boeing, Honeywell, all these defense contractors, what they want to do. And that's what we're watching. And so I think that while this criticism is good, it's also not the total picture, because it's a little too naive of a criticism, as if like the Biden administration is only acting based off of like, we don't want to be perceived as weak by the Republicans. That's part of it, but also he's genuinely like a moderate Republican himself, so he agrees with a lot of these policies. And beyond that, again, he's going to do the bidding of the establishment because they're deeply part of the establishment. So they really think a lot of these decisions that they're making are like, well, duh, this is of course what we're going to do. So, you know, to go through some of the specifics here, talking about backing off of the Iran deal. Yes, the correct thing is to just jump right back into that. And then, you know, the easiest victory of all time. But no, you can't look weak on Iran, so now you try to badger them into getting back in first, even though we violated it, which makes absolutely no sense. Now Biden's being super hawkish on China, which I disagree with. I mean, it sort of reminded me, the way that the right is now leaning into China sort of reminds me of like Russiagate, how the rhetoric from the Democrats was always hawkish on Russia. The rhetoric from the Republicans is always hawkish on China. There's nothing about sitting down, talking, negotiating, getting along, working together. It's all like, you know, you're weak and you need to be stronger and need to go after them. And I don't like that path. Then he brings up Cuba. It was under the Obama administration that they eased tensions with Cuba. And then Trump ramped them back up, and Biden hasn't changed anything yet. It's under review. Now, I get it. You could say, hey, he's trying to do a bunch of other things first. There are some quick things he could definitely do in regards to Cuba that would be positive, but he hasn't done them. You know, Fareed doesn't even bring up Afghanistan and Iraq. But if you think about it, Afghanistan and Iraq, I mean, that's the clearest example of a continuation of Trump's foreign policy and Obama's foreign policy and W. Bush's foreign policy, because we're staying in Afghanistan right now. We're staying in Iraq right now. If anything, we move more in the other direction. They had this agreement by May to get out of, I think it was Afghanistan, and they're already reneging on that deal and saying, no, we want to stay there longer. So, listen, it's just substantively, they're just wrong. These policies are terrible policies. But it's not, they don't really care about peace. That's not really their end goal. A lot of the end goal is to keep the gravy train going for the establishment in the military-industrial complex and be, you know, the world's serious leader. That's how they think of themselves. So it's just, they're all, to one extent or another, they manage the empire, as opposed to having principled stands and really thinking these things through and acting in accordance with U.S. law and international law. That's all out the window. So, but I must say, even though I think his criticism here is lacking a little bit, I really do like the fact that here you have somebody on CNN criticizing Biden's foreign policy and basically saying it's way too much like Trump, it's too right-wing, and that's unacceptable. And he brings up like the things Well, look at the things that Obama did that were a success. The Iran deal, what he did with Cuba. One party brings up his TPP. Totally disagree on that one, but that has more to do with economic policy than just foreign policy, and I don't know why he threw that in. I don't think that would have been a success. I think the deal was actually horrendous. But anyway, I digress from that. Point is, he's correct in saying that the things that were real successes, like the Iran deal was a real success. Easing tensions with Cuba was a real success. The few areas where he did really well, it was totally bucking the consensus and the orthodoxy and the conventional wisdom in Washington, D.C. And what Biden is doing is jumping right back into the conventional wisdom and the orthodoxy in Washington, D.C. And so if he wants to keep doing that, he's going to be a mess. He's going to be totally forgettable on this stuff. He's going to perpetuate the empire, keep committing war crimes, and it's going to be unacceptable. And at this point, at least we have a CNN host who's on the record saying this is too right-wing.